Southern New Hampshire University and her colleague, Lou Amende, conducted the survey, which is available on the Cooperative Foundation's website. The survey includes a complete report of this, the website includes a complete report of the survey, an annotated bibliography of cooperative education materials, and a listing of cooperative education providers. Chris is here today to talk about how the survey was conducted and its findings. Also with us today is Sarah Pike, Executive Administrator of the Association of Cooperative Educators. Sarah participated in the follow-up telephone interviews of the survey participants, and she will handle Q&As regarding the survey findings. We also have with us Margaret Bow, USDA Cooperative Development Specialist in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and a board member of the Cooperative Foundation. Margaret will discuss the Cooperative Foundation's interest in supporting the development of cooperative development materials in the areas identified in the survey. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Chris. Chris?
I'm here. I'm trying to advance the slide. Oh, looks like it worked. Great. So thanks, Leslie. And as Leslie mentioned, I worked on this study with my colleague, Eklu Amenda, who is a professor of marketing at SNHU. We also had two undergraduate students, Paul Nguyen and Carol McDevitt, who assisted in this work. So we started off by trying to assess the literature and to as a starting point, look for what are the deficiencies that we could find. And I should also say that in doing this, we, the screen's not moving forward now. Oh, there we go. Our objective was essentially to support the Foundation's priorities in determining what their strategic focus should be going forward. So we essentially saw this as an opportunity to look at where are the high-quality educational materials in the field and to assess who the cooperative educators are and what their needs are as well as those of the general public. We started with, as a context for the study, using a framework that John Whitman had cited in his 2012 article on co-op education, which was developed by Foley, and Foley identified 4 types of educational orientations in his general classification system, from formal to incidental. And we also, in working on the study, kept in mind that there are multiple modalities for the delivery of co-op education, everything from webinars such as what we're doing today to more formal settings like college classes and certificate trainings, as well as workshops, and kept in mind that the Mondragon and Antigonish movement's experiences actually started with study clubs. So we conducted an overview to try and gauge what settings we needed to include of co-op educators. And as you can see from the list, we attempted to be comprehensive. We also, as a starting point, recognized that the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Development website is perhaps our largest and most complete source of co-op educational materials. And so we recognized that we were going to need to do an annotated bibliography to capture the larger picture of co-op education resources. In getting started on the study, we decided to leave out of consideration the credit union sector because we know that that's an extensive and well-developed set of resources, and we needed to set some manageable parameters given our time and resources. I did, as a board member, have a lot of familiarity with the Food Cooperative Initiative's website, which includes print, podcast, and film resources, and this certainly informed my thinking as to best practices. So to give you an overview of the research, we had an advisory board that consisted of Ann Reynolds from University of Wisconsin, Margaret Bow, and both of them are on the board of the foundation along with Rosemary Mahoney, and so we had the three of them. In addition, we had Sarah Pike from ACE, Melissa Hoover from the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and Taliesin Nyala, who was a staff person with the TESSA, the Toolbox Development Group in Western Massachusetts. And we worked together to compile as complete a list of educators who could be included in a survey. The advisory board was also very helpful in developing the questions and thinking strategically about what we could accomplish with a survey. So the study then attempted to identify organizations as well as individuals and to ask people to share with us information about their experience with educational materials. We then worked from that to identify gaps and challenges according to these criteria of accessibility, adequacy in terms of quality, timeliness, and where there were gaps. We ended up having 368 people for the list of people we sent the survey out to. We also were able to pick up some additional people through having the survey linked to the Foundation's website. We ended up with 102 responses back. The survey itself was conducted between November of last year and January. We then analyzed the closed-ended responses to identify significant areas for consideration, and then we also had 3 open-ended questions that we went through for identifying themes and recurring areas or challenges that people had identified. In addition, we did a review of the literature to create an annotated bibliography that consists of web-based and published sources. And it was decided to add a 5th step in which additional interviews would be conducted with key stakeholders to explore themes that were surfaced in the survey research. So here you can see summarized again the 3 questions that we focused in on and the sources of information and the types of variables or types of information that we were interested in collecting. So just to give you some indication on what we found, one of the things that was really great to discover is the field is staffed by some very talented, experienced people. And as you can see, the vast majority of people working in this field have over 10 years experience. We also found that there's a lot of crossing over in terms of the populations that educators work with. It wasn't exclusively the case that people were just doing board development or just doing trainings for people who want to start a co-op. That there's a lot of crossing over. So I think part of what we found, which I had seen in my earlier research on higher education, is that the people who are often teaching courses in higher education are also doing work either in extension work or through other types of centers. So the more specific details around our findings are going to be picked up by Sarah, but let me just conclude by saying the study has pointed to some useful criteria for how to assess priorities in the production of new training, that there's clearly a need to attract developers of materials who have experience with grassroots, non-white, non-middle class groups, and that resources that would could be developed by game designers, such as simulations and interactive resources, would be a valuable contribution to the field. And lastly, there's still an important need to attract new materials that can drill deeper on issues of finance and business law. So Sarah, I'll hand it over to you at this point.
Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Pike. I'm with the Association of Cooperative Educators. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the interview process that was conducted and how that led to the gaps that we had identified. So to drill down into the information that was gathered through the survey process, the advisory committee had identified about 12 to 15 people who had taken the survey that we then wanted to interview. And these folks represented different sectors as well as levels of education. And by levels of education, I mean they were teaching Co-op 101, co-op developers, they were within co-ops themselves, member of education, as well as the university level. And from these interviews, a few things had emerged. And just to, before I move forward, we will have a discussion portion after I talk about these gaps, and when you, if you'd like to make comments or participate and share your thoughts, there's two ways to do that. You can either click on the raise your hand icon and someone will unmute you, or you can just write your question and thoughts into the chat box. So moving forward, and after the interviews, 5 gaps really seem to bubble to the surface. I'm going to review those. The first is the second level of understanding. Many have been calling this the middle section of education. It goes beyond Co-ops 101, but it's not necessarily education at the university level. One example of this, and it was identified as a gap in and of itself, are business materials. And this came from the perspective of both co-op developers as well as those that were educating within co-ops. And it pertained to all levels of cooperative business, such as legal framework, financial education, within human resources, that sort of thing. So again, understanding the business of cooperatives. And again, teaching that at an accessible level, again, beyond the 101, Co-ops 101, but not necessarily at the university level. The third gap that people were mentioning really talked about the language and having resources written for the layperson or using common language with more explanation given to thoughts and ideas in everyday language and using less cooperative jargon. For example, patronage dividend. What does that mean? How can you explain it to folks that aren't necessarily understanding, have an understanding of the cooperative model, and just using more common language? The fourth gap, resources for Latinos and non-whites, this really related to cultural relevance and having materials that take into account the culture of the audience. For example, Latinos and non-whites, which includes Native Americans, African Americans, a variety of cultures that are, and having different curriculum that addresses these different groups. It was stressed in the interviews, and this came up, that this doesn't just relate to the materials and the curriculum, but also the educators. It's important for cooperative educators to understand and in many instances be integrated into the cultures of the audience. It was also noted that this is true for education among low-income or communities of social and economic inequality. Again, having educators that understand and are aware of the challenges and circumstances among these populations. The fifth was interactive, online and gaming tools and access to educational resources that are online. So perhaps it goes without saying, but these were all identified as distinct and independent gaps. It wasn't as if there was one gap that was identified, and these were the characteristics, business material for Latinos with interactive tools. I mean, and because I think we had interviewed and identified different groups to interview, again, different gaps had emerged. So now, okay, so now we are looking to hear your thoughts and your reactions. Again, two ways to share your thoughts: either type into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and someone will unmute you. And we're really looking at this point for your reactions to the 5 gaps that I had just identified, as well as, do you think there are other gaps that should be mentioned or noted in terms of curriculum that is needed? I'm going to give you a minute. And Cassie, again, I can't see if they raised their hand, so just let me know if you're unmuting someone.
Michael Johnson?
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much. My question was actually back when Chris was talking and going through the list of materials, et cetera. And so my question has to do with books were never listed. Books like Jessica Gordon-Nimhart's Cooperative Courage, for one thing, and then online journals like Geo. So I'm just wondering how education is being framed here.
I can speak to that, Michael. If you have a chance to look at the full report, we actually did look at published sources, and I did include Jessica's book as part of the resources that were considered in the study, as well as some other articles that Jessica has written. The main challenge that we found in going through the literature is that scholarly work, for those of us who are in scholarly settings where we're expected to do more academic type of writing, don't work for a general audience, whereas, for example, the Geo articles are great, and those also, Geo is listed, I should say, in the annotated bibliography.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Vernon Oakes?
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I've taught with the National Association of Housing Co-ops. I've taught at their annual meetings and quarterly meetings with the Potomac Association of Housing Co-ops. I've also had 12 years of academic teaching, mainly at the college level. And so the gaps that you have identified, I totally agree with. And I'm African American, and most of the persons that I speak to or teach in the cooperative literature, the cooperative knowledge are African Americans or poor, coming from a lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I get the gaps that you talk about, but in teaching business and marketing and finance, particularly budgeting, just the core knowledge of math, understanding arithmetic, sometimes gets to be one of the problems. And I thought when you were talking about the core basics or the middle section, I thought you were going to talk about the reading, writing, arithmetic kinds of things that are needed. But I totally agree with everything that you've said. And I find that in teaching things like budgeting and finance, I will take it to teaching them about their home budget and talking about their own individual house budget before I talk about the budget of the co-op or the housing co-op or any larger budget, so I can get them to something they can understand and get to, and then I can take it in further. So I totally agree with everything you said and add to it the fundamental skills of math, arithmetic, reading and writing, and then using examples that they can identify with. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Vernon. Yeah, that really goes to, I guess, then having a core curriculum of just knowledge before we layer on the cooperative. And I think it also goes to the gap of having this delivered in really common language that people can understand in their everyday lives. Great. Thanks for the comment.
Charlene V.
Yes, hi. My name is Shar Vries from the Minnesota Cooperative Education Foundation, which is a foundation of Cooperative Network, the Minnesota and Wisconsin Trade Association for Co-ops. One of the things, and just, Sarah, your question about are these gaps that you agree with? Absolutely. As I'm putting my trade association hat on, definitely, especially with minority populations. And then putting my both of my hats on as our foundation and a trade association, we have been hearing from co-op employers that for their employees, because even though where we're located in both the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin, #1 and 2 state co-op states of the nation, we still struggle with our co-op members in obtaining employees and hiring employees that know what a co-op is. And so it's not only just on the 101 level, but in that intermediary level, Sarah, that you talked about, what's a patronage distribution, and those sort of things. And so what we are hearing from co-ops is the need for some kind of, tutorial that they can, in a basic training of a co-op employee, sit down and Sarah, I had mentioned this too at some point too, they can sit down and kind of do an online self-directed, tutorial. And so that is something that, we have been looking at as both our foundation and the trade association. But other gaps that we think that I think should be mentioned have somewhat been mentioned here. So I don't have anything at this point in time to talk to with that, but this has been really helpful, and I'm so glad that you guys have done this, and I look forward to hearing more of everybody else's thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Shar. I believe we've had some questions in the chat. I can't see them. Casey, would it be possible if you could read those?
Sure, absolutely. I have one question from Stephanie Mood. It says, are there necessary materials for understanding strategies for how people can work together democratically in groups? This would also be pertinent for diverse cultures.
So are there different education methods? Is that what you're, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but I will attempt to answer this. I would say in some cases, yes, at least in my experience within the interviews, I interviewed some folks at the Latino Economic Community Development Center, and they were very adamant about, at least as it related to educating the Latino population, in terms of the time frame. They probably had 3 sessions to get the information in, because that was what they were interested in sitting through, and then they were ready to get to work. So understanding that from a cultural perspective, the delivery, who's delivering it. So I think from that sort of strategic standpoint in your delivery, I think it is important and will vary based on the population. Let's see. And then also in terms of perhaps educating from a democratic standpoint, TESA, the Toolbox for Education and Social Action, is developing curriculum and teaching styles specifically related to this philosophy around democratic participation within the classroom. Hopefully that helps to answer your question.
We have a question. Petra Perkins, you're now unmuted. Petra? Urban Crowell?
Yes, thank you. I have 2 basic comments, or one that I think might be useful here is I
in my experience with co-op education, I continue to see a challenge with the basic definition of what we mean when we're talking about, cooperative enterprise. I think that's a much bigger issue, but I think that the question I wanted to focus on is co-ops in the academy, and I've been involved teaching for a number of years and have seen a number of programs come and go, and I think a very valuable follow-up to this study might be looking at the various academic programs that have involved cooperatives and cooperative education, which have survived, which have not, and why, so we can learn from this. I feel like we've invested a lot of time and resources into creating academic programs that may or may not be sustainable over time. So I would just suggest that as a follow-up.
Urban, just to respond to you, I've actually done a fair bit of that work, and I'm happy to share what I've done with you. It's not published because I just haven't gotten that far with it yet, but the data collection is fairly complete, and I can share that with you.
Okay, publishing that might be useful.
Yeah, understood. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question really directed at Chris in the chat box. I'll read this. From the audiences that Chris outlined, it seems to me that it might be worthwhile to consider the resources for those who want to start a co-op from the other audiences, because substantial loss of investment is at risk here versus other more educational losses. Were there underlying assumptions about the materials for startups being used in conjunction with experienced developers versus being used for do-it-yourselfers?
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you do surveys because you're kind of at the mercy of who will give you their time to answer the surveys. And I have to just acknowledge that the Cooperation Works folks were very good at responding to the survey. So I think, in terms of who we heard well from, the people who are typically in a situation doing development or education around startups were very well represented in the responses. The academics were another group that responded well to the survey, and was actually in response to the last point from Urban. We were able to identify some people who I hadn't identified in the earlier work that I was doing on this in 2013. I hope that answers your question.
Michael Johnson?
I see, were there others that had their hands raised? Thanks.
Hi, me again. Thank you. I've been very actively involved in the whole cooperative movement for about the last, worker co-op movement and solidarity economics for the last 7 or 8 years. Before that, I've been involved in intentional communities. And intentional communities put a lot of emphasis on experiential learning. That is, you learn conflict resolution, you learn listening, you learn communication, et cetera, and in a context that promotes a lot of cooperation. And so I don't, in my limited experience in the more public cooperative areas, I have not seen that much emphasis on the experiential learning. Am I off base? Am I missing something? Did you all cover that? Again, I haven't read the report yet.
Chris, do you want to address this first?
Well, Michael, I'm trying to, by learning by doing, are you talking about things like shadowing people in the workplace, or, our focus was to interview people who are engaged in education and training, and to try to capture comprehensively the literature that is web-based as well as published sources. So learning by doing, I'm not sure that that's something we could have captured well given the scope of what we set out to do.
I have a question from Rod Kelsey. I see a gap of cooperatives desiring to teach their members and employees about our cooperative story. Is there a sense of cooperative businesses desire to educate more or less?
Chris, did you want to address this? Or
yeah, I'm trying to think about how to answer that. We didn't really get responses from many people in an employer's role. We had much more of a response from the development community and from people like Rod who are working with staff and boards at a regional level. So for example, we didn't hear from food co-op directors or from directors of some of the worker co-ops. That was a group that we didn't directly reach.
Yeah, and I would say from the interviews that I did, in terms of business education or I'd say that it was more about capacities within the cooperative, so understanding co-op finance, more understanding to make the business themselves stronger, as opposed to maybe telling the story. But that's really just from the interviews that I had done. Okay, it looks like we have a question here from Petra. I am pleased that you have highlighted the cultural elements. This area I have found the least well developed, and it's most pertinent in the programs I have been working in developing. In East County, Washington, I have a concern that we continue to look at Mondragon as a model, which is culturally homogenous. This isn't the reality in the U.S., certainly not the population that I'm working with. If I could maybe answer this first, I would agree in terms of looking at that as a specific model. The folks that I had interviewed had been working with different populations, Native Americans, Latinos, African Americans, and there were definitely distinct different cultural aspects, historical aspects that needed to go into the curriculum. It wasn't one non-white thing that needed to go into this curriculum. So I appreciate that comment because there was definitely a distinction among the different populations and how the curriculum needs to be adapted culturally. Chris, did you have any follow-up on that?
No, I was trying to figure out how I would respond. I mean, for those of you who know me, you know that I spent a lot of time at Mondragon for the last 30 years. And Mondragon is actually, grew out of the oppression of the Basque people under Franco. And yet today, as the place of employment, is more comprehensive than just Basques in terms of who works within the group. So they have had to figure out how to be inclusive in more recent years themselves. And so I recognize and appreciate the Petra's concern about Mondragon as being homogeneous culturally, but I think the criticism of homogeneity culturally has been something that the larger cooperative community has struggled with in many places. And it's often that homogeneity that's an initial source of trust and bonding that brings people together. And we shouldn't underestimate the value of that, but it's also true that that cooperatives need to be a place that is open and voluntary membership, and that membership is one that is welcoming of diversity and not just exclusive to one group or another.
Interest. Let's see, we did have a comment that I'll read from Mary. I concur that the training people of color and users of other language, plus people familiar with low-income communities, is crucial. A scholarship program to help people get training and present at conferences would be very useful. Comment. Within your chat box, you might be able to see there's a link to the full report if you haven't already been able to see that. Cassie, are there others that have raised their hands for questions? Or?
Betsy Black.
Okay, here's the question. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Betsy.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
We have one question here in the chat box from Brenda. One gap noted was a deeper dive into financial training. Can you give an example of the kinds of materials that should be developed? Chris, did you want to answer first?
Sarah, why don't you take that one?
Okay. At least within the folks that I had interviewed, it seemed like the financial training was related to really two groups. One is co-op developers, those teaching about how to develop co-ops and the financial rigor it takes to start a co-op, just like starting a business. The other was more as it relates to financial training within the cooperative itself and understanding the finances of the cooperative. Again, business capacity, that sort of thing, and understanding that kind of financial literacy, I guess you should say. Those were the two different types of financial training that I came across. And then if, in terms of the materials that should be developed around that, you know, I think a lot of this has to do with the accessibility to training and these resources. For example, for the co-op developer, Cooperation Works does have a financial training. I know that the NCBA just put on a conference. I'm not sure if financial aspects were a part of that, but it really dove into, again, capacity, CPAs, lawyers within the co-op business model. Hopefully that answers your question.
Pat Sterner.
We
Pat?
Oh, hi, yeah, I just wanted to, yes, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
I just wanted to follow up on the note about the Co-op Professionals Conference. It was held in Denver this past weekend. It was for primarily attended by attorneys and CPAs, and I had actually just sent a note that you don't have to read now, Cassie, but the there's a lot of discussion around education from a business and finance standpoint for cooperatives, and both the professors who were attending and practitioners were very focused in this area. So and want to be engaged, you know, as this moves forward, to be a part of the discussion and also part of the solution.
Thanks, Pat. I appreciate the comments. Okay. Betsy, are there others that have raised their hands?
Not that I can see. We do have a question from Natalie Locke. As a relatively new cooperative educator, this list resonates. Certainly, accessibility is an issue in terms of educational materials, being primarily for educated white folks with the language to talk about patronage refunds, etc. I might expand on the interactive gap to include in-person educational resources as well. They tend to be presentation-based rather than kinesthetic, movement-based, and interactive. More games, role plays, and other education resources would be especially valuable to youth audiences who are the future of the cooperative movement?
Great. Thanks, Sally. I know that there, in terms of, you know, well, the popular education resources, I know within the last ACE Institute, there was a educational workshop on that. Those techniques and tactics have been becoming very popular, especially as it relates to teaching and addressing, you know, general public, those that aren't necessarily are in the context of a cooperative business or something, or reaching out to larger populations. Great comment. Chris, any follow-up to that?
Oh, just the point about one-on-ones is one that resonates with me, because that's often where my co-op education work takes me these days, and so it you know it has to be stuff that is simple enough to pick up and work with one or two people at a time in your office, and there's certainly a need for thinking about how we engage people on that level as well.
I do see that we have other comments, but I am going to move along in our slides just to see my slides moving forward, though. Because we have one other group of questions that we're interested in learning about. So you can add these to your discussion questions. That would be great. As Chris had mentioned, the USDA cooperative education materials are one of the main go-to resources. And we're interested in knowing potentially how the USDA can improve upon the effectiveness of these materials. You know, keeping in mind that these were really developed for agricultural settings and cooperatives. We're also interested in knowing if you have used these materials, how have you adapted them to other non-agricultural settings. So certainly interested in understanding that. I'll go back to the comments and questions, though. I think we need to, this is a comment from Petra. I think we need to look at this from the perspective of helping groups identify shared values. This works whether we are in a diverse or homogeneous population. Good point, Petra. Question from Julia. It would be good to identify content that does or can apply across sectors versus information that is specific to, for example, food co-ops, housing co-ops, utilities, etc. Does this research address that level, or do you know of efforts to do so? Chris, and this one to you.
Lost. Could you repeat that?
Oh, sure. Oops, I just lost the question. Essentially, it's looking for resources that can apply across sectors versus information that is specific to specific sectors, such as food co-ops, housing co-ops, utilities, etc. Does this research address that level, or do you know of efforts to do so? Nope. Chris, are you there?
Oh, sorry. I thought I was unmuted. So my suggestion is if you go to the annotated bibliography, I've included a lot of good detail on what is available, and typically what you'll find in terms of going across sector is that the there is less of that, because authors tend to focus on a particular sector with their work. Cross-sectoral, you know, E.G. Nato's work, he did a couple of books that encompassed all sectors and tried to be comprehensive. The NCBA used to have a very good site for general access, but when they revised their website, they took that off, and I have to say you're going to have a harder time finding that general cross-sectoral stuff. The International Cooperative Alliance website does include information by regions that would, some of which would be cross-sectoral. But look at the annotated bibliography, and you'll be able to see a more complete listing of what's there.
Here's another question. What about access to education as a gap? How do we meet communities where they are and utilize various strategies such as popular education, cooperative organizing, in addition to the traditional methods mentioned? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of it is knowing, I think, within your region, who out there has the need for education, and specifically for some of the groups that I work with. For example, Cooperation Works. It deals with cooperative development training. And I know that we've had ongoing discussions about, how can the centers themselves be resources for education, because they're tapped into their communities and understand their needs. Again, then the next question is, where are the resources for them to educate? But good question. Chris, any other thoughts on that? Did you hear that question?
I'll pass on that one. I think you've got it covered.
This question from Julia: can we discuss what directions the foundation might take to address the needs the study identifies? Well, that might be a perfect entree into our next speaker, Margaret Bow. So,
yeah.
And since there's only 10 minutes left, I'll turn it over to Margaret.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah and Chris. And just wanted to share a couple of thoughts before we wrap it up. First of all, okay, whoops, excuse me. So for the Cooperative Foundation's next steps, we look forward to partnering with USDA and other educators to continue to address those identified gaps. And then we at the Cooperative Foundation are committed to using our funds. Granted, our funds are somewhat limited, but we want to make good use of our funds to support the development of co-op education materials. And moving forward with that, we are going to take this study as helping us to set our grant-making priorities for 2015. It's going to be the funding of the development of education materials, especially those identified by this survey. You can certainly visit our website, the Cooperative Foundation website, and I'll put that website address on the next slide, and you can see a complete description of all our grant priorities. Our grant priorities have traditionally included attendance at co-op education programs and sponsorship of national and local events that are targeted to co-op development. So, for instance, local events would be Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, and South Dakota, but we also sponsor attendance at events that are on a national scale. So, I'll put up that website that you can find the entire study on, and also our grant-making priorities for 2015. But we would also like to stress that we wish to, with the education materials that we do fund, we want to make sure that those materials are made widely available for little or at cost, at low cost. We don't want to fund materials that become proprietary to a particular organization. One of the study findings is that it's important that this information is widely disseminated. So we'd like to honor that. So I think there is still time left. Could we continue on with some of the questions?
I do see a question here for the annotated bibliography. When you click on the link, you can find, they've broken it down so that you can see the whole survey, the bibliography, so there are different sections if there's specific things that you are interested in. All right.
So thank you, Margaret. This is Leslie Mead again. I know there are a number of additional questions, and since we're running out of time, we will post these questions and respond to them on the website. So I want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar today. You can contact us at the email address on the slide. If you have any projects or programs that might fall within the survey findings that the Cooperative Foundation would be interested in, I encourage you to email us and we can talk about that. So thank you again for participating and enjoy the rest of your day.